In my family, kindness was not a virtue so much as an automatic setting. We were the kind of people who said yes before we knew the question, who laughed at jokes that hurt, who took blame like it was a coat we were born wearing. Our apartment sat above a narrow storefront on Willow Street, where my father repaired bicycles and my mother stitched torn bags for the neighborhood delivery riders. The shop's bell chimed with every customer, and the sound had trained us like a leash. Greet, smile, apologize, fix, discount, apologize again. My older brother June could true a wheel by ear, tapping spokes until the metal sang the right note. I could read people the way June read tires, spotting the thin places where pressure would eventually cause a blowout. My name is Lena, and for most of my life I used that talent to keep everyone comfortable, including the people who didn't deserve comfort at all. The first time I realized comfort could be dangerous, I was 16 and watched my father hand a full refund to a man who had clearly crashed his own bike into a lamppost. The man's voice was loud and confident. My father's was soft and apologetic. After the man left with the money and a new set of brake pads, my father swept up the broken glass and said, "It's fine. We don't want trouble." I believed him because I wanted to. Later, my mother would call that sentence our family motto. She would say it the way other mothers say grace before meals. "It's fine. We don't want trouble." It kept us alive in a way. It also kept us small. June was the gentlest person I knew, which meant relatives loved assigning him tasks. When our aunt hosted gatherings, June carried the food, cleaned the plates, repaired the wobbling chair, and listened politely to insults disguised as advice. He never argued. He believed that the best way to win was to make the conflict disappear. So when our relatives decided June needed to be married to a girl from a good family, he didn't object. He only looked a little pale. They arranged a tea meeting, then another, then a third. Each time, June came home more exhausted, as if he had run a race in his head without moving his feet. I asked him whether he liked the girl. He said he didn't know, then apologized for not knowing. That was June, apologizing for his own uncertainty. On the night everything shifted, June returned not from another arranged meeting, but from the city hall. He held a folded certificate in one hand and a plastic bag in the other, the kind that carries emergency groceries. Behind him stood a woman about my age, wearing a slate-gray blazer and boots scuffed at the toes. She looked like someone who walked fast on purpose. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth instead of a ribbon, and her eyes were direct in a way that made my throat tighten, as if I might owe her an explanation. June cleared his throat and said, "This is Sierra. We're married." My mother dropped a thread spool, and it rolled under the couch like it wanted to hide. My father began the familiar intake of breath that came before an apology. Sarah beat him to it. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "We're not doing the sorry thing tonight." Sierra did not arrive with suitcases, only a backpack and a worn notebook covered in tabs. She shook my parents' hands with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, then looked around our small apartment as if she were mapping exits and hazards. It wasn't judgment, it was assessment. June hovered near her shoulder like a cautious satellite. I asked how they met, because that seemed like a reasonable question to ask about a surprise marriage. June looked at his shoes. Sarah answered. "He was at the clinic where I work," she said, "trying to get a prescription for your father but refusing to cut the line. I watched him apologize to strangers for taking up space. It was the saddest thing I'd seen all week." Then she added, "I told him to stop apologizing. He tried. He failed. I offered him coffee. He listened. We kept talking. 1 month later, when his relatives tried to trap him into an engagement, he asked me for help. I said yes, but only if he chose me because he wanted to, not because he was escaping." June finally looked up and said, "I wanted to." The words came out shaky but clear. Rumors moved through our building as quickly as steam through a shared hallway. By morning, the neighbor who sold dumplings on the corner had announced that my brother had married a tiger. The security guard downstairs raised his eyebrows when June and Sarah left for work. A distant cousin messaged me to ask whether Sarah was difficult. People love that word because it makes cowardice sound like caution. Our relatives arrived that weekend with a basket of fruit and the sharp excitement of people expecting a show. Aunt May took one look at Sarah's boots and said, "You couldn't find a more modern wife." June's fingers twitched, ready to smooth the insult. Sarah smiled politely and said, "Modern is just another word for not letting people step on you." Then she asked Aunt May where the fruit was from and whether she kept the receipt, because if it was overpriced, she'd like to know which store was cheating. The room went quiet. June's jaw dropped. My mother hid a laugh behind her hand. My father stared at Sarah as if he had never witnessed someone question a gift without shame. Sarah's job, we learned, was at a community legal clinic that helped low-income residents fight predatory contracts. Landlords who changed terms mid-lease, employers who withheld wages, debt collectors who used fear as currency. She spoke about these cases the way my father spoke about cracked frames, careful, exact, and irritated at preventable damage. She also asked questions no one asked in our family. Why does your landlord charge extra for the staircase light when it's a safety requirement? Why do you give discounts to customers who yell? Why do you let your aunt borrow money without a repayment date? Each question was a mirror held up to our habits. Each one made my stomach twist with the familiar urge to apologize. Sarah seemed to sense it, because whenever my father began to say sorry, she offered him a different sentence. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for understanding. Gratitude, she told us, is not the same as surrender. The first real collision happened because of me. My boyfriend Evan insisted on meeting Sarah, claiming he wanted to welcome her to the family. Evan was charming in crowds and controlling in corners. He liked to place his hand at my waist as if he were guiding me through space I had lived in longer than he had. He corrected my jokes, corrected my tone, corrected my opinions. When I tried to disagree, he laughed and said I was cute when I pretended. That evening he arrived wearing a watch that cost more than our monthly rent and carrying a bottle of wine he didn't ask whether we drank. He complimented my mother's cooking, then immediately explained how she could improve it. He praised June's simple job, then suggested June should learn ambition. He looked at Sarah and asked, with a grin, "So are you the type who keeps a man in line, or does he keep you in line?" The question was designed to make June shrink and to make Sarah perform. Sarah set her chopsticks down with deliberate care and said, "Neither. Adults keep themselves in line." Then Evan turned to me and said, "Lena knows that. She's always been easy." The word easy landed like a slap dressed in silk. My mother's shoulders tightened. My father stared into his soup. June reached for water, an old habit of offering comfort without confrontation. My throat tightened, and I felt the familiar reflex to smile, to reduce the moment, to protect Evan from consequences as if consequences were something he deserved protection from. Sarah watched my face, and her expression changed, not anger, not pity, but recognition. Evan continued, warming to his audience. He joked about how my family would have to pull together for our wedding, how my parents could sell the shop in a few years to fund a proper apartment for us, how bride prices were old-fashioned, but he would accept gifts because tradition matters. He laughed at his own words. Then he added, casually, "Since Lena already moved in with me on weekends, everyone knows the hard part is done. That means we can skip the formalities." He lifted his glass as if he had made a toast. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the refrigerator hum. Sarah did not throw anything at him. That would have been too simple. Instead, she reached into her backpack, pulled out her tabbed notebook, and flipped to a page with printed forms. She slid one across the table to Evan. "This is a consent and financial disclosure checklist," she said, "used in mediation sessions when families discuss marriage expectations. It has space for your income, debt, and any outstanding legal disputes. Since you're the one bringing up tradition and money, let's start with transparency." Evan blinked. He tried to laugh, but the laugh came out thin. He said he didn't need to disclose anything to random people. Sarah nodded as if he had confirmed a suspicion. "Okay," she said. "Then we don't discuss selling the shop, and we don't discuss gifts, and we don't discuss a wedding. We discuss your manners." She pointed at the sentence on the form that said, "Respect is non-negotiable." Evan scoffed and said, "I'm joking. Everyone's so sensitive." Sarah looked at him and said, "Jokes are supposed to be funny to the people they're about." Then she turned to me. "Lena, do you want to marry a man who introduces himself by telling your parents what they owe him?" My chest felt like it might crack. I opened my mouth and, for the first time, did not fill it with apology. I said, "No." Evan's smile collapsed. He snapped, suddenly sharp, that I was embarrassing him. He accused Sarah of poisoning my mind. He stood up too fast, and his chair scraped the floor like a warning. When he reached for my wrist, June moved on instinct, the way you move to catch a falling plate. June's hand closed around Evan's forearm, not violent, just firm. Evan's eyes widened, surprised that my brother's gentleness had an edge. Sarah stood as well, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around her calm. She didn't shout. She said, "If you touch her again, I will file for a protective order so quickly You will still be thinking of a comeback when the notice arrives. Evan tried to insult her, tried to call her controlling, tried to make her sound crazy, the way men do when they realize they can't win. Sarah smiled slightly and said, "Words don't scare me. Paper does." Then she pointed to the door and said, "Leave." Evan threw one last line over his shoulder, something about how no one else would tolerate me, and walked out. The door closed. The air changed. My mother began to cry, not because she thought I was ruined, but because she realized how long she had watched me be handled like property. My father looked at me and whispered, "I'm proud you said no." He did not apologize for saying it late. After Evan left, I shook so hard my teeth clicked. Sarah poured me water and sat across from me like a steady wall. She asked, gently, "Are you safe?" It was a practical question, not a romantic one. I admitted Evan had yelled before, had grabbed me once, had tracked my phone with concern. I admitted I had kept those facts hidden because I didn't want my family to worry, and because worry in our family always turned into guilt. Sarah listened without interrupting. Then she said, "We're going to turn your life back into yours." She helped me change passwords, disable location sharing, and document messages. She spoke to June and my parents about what to do if Evan showed up. She wrote down emergency numbers on a note taped inside the cupboard where we kept rice. "Preparation," she said, "is love in a form that works." The next week, trouble arrived wearing a familiar face. Aunt May. She came to check on June and make sure the new wife understood our family values, which was her way of saying she wanted control back. She sat in our shop on a stool and announced that June's sudden marriage embarrassed the relatives, and that embarrassment required compensation. She demanded June attend a banquet to apologize to the family elders. My father began to nod automatically. Sarah asked, "What exactly did June do wrong?" Aunt May said he disrespected them by choosing his own spouse. Sarah replied, "That's not disrespect. That's adulthood." Aunt May's cheeks flushed. She pivoted to money, claiming the relatives had already paid for matchmakers and gifts and deserved reimbursement. Sarah asked for receipts. Aunt May said it wasn't about receipts, it was about honor. Sarah nodded and said, "Honor without evidence is just a story people tell to collect money." Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Potential fraud, matchmaker fees." Aunt May squinted at the words as if they were poison. Aunt May tried a different weapon, pity. She said June's grandparents would be heartbroken. She said my mother would be blamed. She said neighbors would talk. My mother's mouth trembled, because in our world, being talked about was a kind of social death. Sarah leaned forward and said, "Let them talk. Talking doesn't pay rent, and it doesn't repair a bike." My mother stared. Sarah continued, softer, "You have spent your whole life trying to be harmless, but harmlessness doesn't stop harm. It just makes you the easiest target." Aunt May stood up, furious, and announced she would cut June out of the family. June's shoulders tensed, the old fear of being unloved by blood. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezed once, and said, "If love can be revoked like a coupon, it was never love." Aunt May left, and I heard my father exhale as if he had been holding his breath for decades. Sarah's influence did not turn us into loud people overnight. It turned us into clear people. She helped my parents post a simple sign in the shop. Prices are listed. Discounts are offered by us, not demanded. Abuse will end service. My father practiced saying those sentences in the mirror as if he were learning a speech. The first time a customer argued, my father's voice shook, but he repeated the policy anyway. The customer huffed and left. My mother looked terrified. Then a quieter customer walked in, read the sign, and said, "Finally." That word finally felt like a reward. We began to realize that boundaries attract the right people the way light attracts moths. You don't control who comes, but you do change what's possible in the space. Sarah also insisted June stop doing free labor for relatives who treated him like a tool. She drafted a one-page contract template for repair work, with sections for cost, deadline, and payment terms. She made it so simple my father could understand it at a glance. When a cousin brought a broken scooter and said, "I'll pay you later," June handed him the form and said, "Sign." The cousin laughed, expecting June to fold. June did not fold, he said. "Sign, or take it elsewhere." The cousin muttered about arrogance, but he signed. When he paid on time, June looked surprised, as if he had discovered a new law of physics. Sarah told him, "People respect what you respect. If you treat your labor like it's disposable, others will too." My own transformation was uglier at first. Without Evan's constant commentary, my mind felt quiet and exposed, like a room after furniture has been removed. I realized how many of my preferences had been negotiated away. I didn't know what music I liked without being teased. I didn't know what food I craved without worrying it was inconvenient. Sarah suggested I write down small decisions each day. What I wanted for lunch, what route I preferred walking, which friend I missed. The list looked childish. It also felt like evidence of existence. I enrolled in a night course on supply chain management at a local college because I wanted something practical that could help the shop grow. Sarah raised an eyebrow and said, "Why supply chain?" I told her I was tired of being dependent on people who controlled prices and delivery schedules. She nodded. "That's a good reason. We can build power by understanding systems," she said. And for the first time, the word power didn't make me flinch. Then, as if to test us, the building owner decided to raise our rent. Mr. Park owned half the block, and his favorite hobby was pretending kindness was optional. He sent a letter claiming renovations were required and rent would increase by 30%, effective immediately. There was no mention of what renovations, no schedule, no legal notice period. My mother read the letter and began to cry. My father said, "Maybe we can work more hours." June offered to sell his motorcycle. The old motto rose in the room like smoke. "It's fine. We don't want trouble." Sarah took the letter, read it twice, and said, "He's bluffing." Then she asked my mother for the lease. My mother hesitated because she had never questioned paperwork. She treated documents the way she treated elders, with unquestioned reverence. Sarah waited. My mother produced the lease from a plastic folder. Sarah pointed to a clause about notice periods and renovation responsibilities. She tapped the page with her finger and said, "The law is already on your side. You've just never used it." The next day, Sarah took June and me to meet other tenants. We visited the old couple upstairs who ran a tiny laundry service, the single mother next door who sold fried chicken from her kitchen, the delivery riders who shared a 2-room unit and slept in shifts. Each had received the same letter. Each looked scared and ashamed, as if their fear were a personal failure. Sarah introduced herself, explained the clause, and asked them to sign a collective request for proper notice and proof of renovations. At first, no one moved. Collective action is hard when you've been trained to survive alone. Then the old man with the laundry said, "I have saved every rent receipt for 15 years. His wife nodded and brought out a box like a treasure chest. The delivery riders produced screenshots of bank transfers. The single mother produced photos of mold the landlord had ignored. Evidence piled up on Sarah's table like bricks. Sarah smiled. "Now we have a wall," she said. Mr. Park responded to our request by showing up in person with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood in our shop, pretending to admire a bicycle frame while threatening us in gentle words. He said he could find better tenants if we were difficult. He said he could report our shop for violations if we caused problems. My father began to apologize. Sarah stepped between them, small but immovable. She said, "If you have a legal complaint, submit it in writing. If you don't, stop harassing tenants." Mr. Park laughed and said, "Young lady, you don't understand how things work." Sarah replied, "I understand exactly. You're used to people negotiating with fear instead of law. We're done negotiating with fear." She handed him a folder containing the tenants' signatures and evidence. Mr. Park's smile tightened. He said he would think about it. Sarah nodded and said, "Great, your deadline is Friday." Then she returned to labeling bike parts as if the landlord were a passing gust. Friday came. Mr. Park did not back down. He sent a second letter, more aggressive, claiming eviction would begin soon. Sarah did not panic. She filed a formal complaint with the housing office and arranged a free consultation session at the clinic, inviting every tenant. The waiting room filled with neighbors who usually avoided eye contact. Seeing them together changed something. Fear is louder in isolation. In a crowd, it has to compete. The housing officer visited the building the next week. Mr. Park suddenly became polite. He offered to postpone the rent increase, as if he were giving us a gift. Sarah refused the framing. She said, "You will follow the contract, and you will address the mold, and you will stop threatening tenants." The officer watched him sign an agreement. When it was done, my mother whispered, "I can't believe we did that." Sarah replied, "You didn't do something impossible. You did something unfamiliar. There's a difference." News of our small victory spread, and with it came backlash. A cousin's husband confronted June outside the shop, calling him disrespectful for letting his wife talk to elders and landlords. Jun's face reddened. Old patterns tugged at him. Then Jun said, quietly, I didn't let her. I chose her, and I choose myself too. The cousin's husband sputtered, unprepared for Jun's spine. He called Jun ungrateful. Jun nodded once and said, if gratitude means accepting abuse, then yes, I'm ungrateful. He walked back inside. I watched from the doorway, stunned. It wasn't that Jun had become a different person. He had become a fuller version of himself, one that included anger where anger was appropriate. Sierra did not only teach us to fight, she taught us to recover. After conflicts, she insisted we rest, eat, and talk through what happened without blaming ourselves. She noticed my mother's hands shook for hours after confronting Mr. Park. She noticed my father couldn't sleep because he kept replaying the landlord's threats. She explained what stress does to the body, how adrenaline lingers, how old trauma can wake up. My parents had never used the word trauma for themselves. They reserved it for wars and disasters, not for quiet years of being treated as less. Sierra told them, repeated small humiliations add up. Your nervous system keeps the receipts. Then she taught my mother breathing exercises, and she taught my father how to write down worries so they wouldn't loop endlessly at night. These were not dramatic solutions. They were maintenance, like oiling a chain so it doesn't grind itself apart. Around this time, Evan tried to return. He sent messages from new numbers, alternately apologizing and accusing me. He claimed Sarah had manipulated me. He told my friends I had lost my mind. He showed up at my college after class, holding flowers like a shield. My stomach knotted. I wanted to disappear, because disappearing had always been my safest move. Then I remembered Sarah's checklist. Document, set boundaries, don't debate. I held my phone up and said, I'm recording. Evan's eyes flickered. He called me dramatic. I said, you are not allowed to contact me again. If you do, I will file a report. Evan laughed at first, then saw my face, then realized the old version of me was gone. He dropped the flowers in a trash bin and walked away. My hands shook, but I didn't chase him with explanation. I went home and told Sarah. She nodded once and said, good. You closed the door without apologizing for the sound. With Evan gone, my life did not become instantly peaceful. It became spacious. I had room for friendships I had neglected. I had room to study. I had room to notice what I wanted. I also had room to notice Sierra's loneliness. She was always surrounded by people at the clinic, always solving problems, always holding boundaries for others. At home, she sometimes stared at nothing, as if she were listening to a conversation only she could hear. One night I found her on the roof of our building, sitting with her knees drawn up, watching the city lights. I asked whether she was okay. She answered honestly, I'm tired of being the one who pushes. I asked why she kept pushing anyway. She shrugged, because if I don't, people like Mr. Park win by default. Then she told me about her childhood, about moving between relatives who treated her as an inconvenience, about working at 14, about learning that politeness didn't protect you, it only made you more useful. She said she had decided early to become difficult on purpose. Listening, I realized Sarah's toughness was not a lack of feeling. It was a kind of chosen armor. As months passed, Jun and Sierra's marriage revealed itself not as a rescue story but as a partnership between two different strengths. Jun steadied Sierra when she burned out, bringing her tea, fixing her broken laptop hinge, reminding her to eat. Sarah steadied Jun when old guilt tried to swallow him, reminding him that boundaries are not betrayal. They argued sometimes, but their arguments were honest, not passive. In our family, disagreement used to feel like a cliff edge. Watching them, I began to see it as a bridge, scary to cross, but built to hold weight. My parents' shop began to change too. We set clear hours and stopped answering calls late at night. We raised prices slightly and discovered that the customers who respected us stayed, while the customers who enjoyed exploiting us drifted away. June started teaching neighborhood kids basic bike repair in exchange for volunteer hours, and those kids began to treat the shop like a community space. My mother started a small online page selling refurbished bags and helmet straps, writing honest descriptions instead of apologetic ones. When someone messaged to demand a discount because times are hard, my mother replied, "Times are hard for everyone, which is why fair pricing matters." I stared at her message, amazed. My mother had learned to be kind without being consumed. Then a bigger test arrived. A flood. The river that ran behind Willow Street rose after 3 days of relentless rain, creeping into basements, swallowing stored inventory, forcing businesses to shut their doors. Our shop sat just high enough to avoid the first wave. But neighbors weren't so lucky. The laundry couple upstairs lost their machines. The fried chicken mother lost her freezer. Delivery riders couldn't work because the streets were rivers. In the past, our family would have helped quietly and separately, delivering soup and apologies. Sarah called a meeting. She asked who needed what, who had what, and who could coordinate. She turned our shop into a supply hub, charging phone banks with a generator June repaired, setting up a whiteboard list of needs, arranging rides for elders. I handled communication, using group chats and printed notices because power was unreliable. My father used his repair skills to fix a sump pump. My mother cooked in shifts with other neighbors, creating an assembly line of meals. The flood didn't care about our newfound confidence, but our confidence helped us care for each other anyway. After the water receded, officials arrived in reflective vests to take photos and offer vague promises. A representative suggested that residents should be patient while aid was processed. The old motto stirred, ready to sedate us. Sarah stepped forward and asked for a timeline. The representative repeated the word process. Sarah asked for the name of the process, the forms required, and the office responsible. She asked for those details in writing. The representative tried to deflect. Sarah smiled, calm and relentless, and said, "Our patience has a limit, and your paperwork will not be a mystery." People behind her began to nod. The representative eventually handed over a printed guide and promised a follow-up meeting. It wasn't everything, but it was more than a photo. Later, June said, "I didn't know you could make them answer." Sarah replied, "They answer when you ask questions they can't escape." My studies advanced. I learned how goods moved through warehouses, how small delays became large losses, how contracts hid risk in polite language. The more I learned, the more I understood why my family had been exploited. We had operated on trust in a system that rewarded cunning. I began volunteering at Sarah's clinic, helping clients translate invoices and understand payment terms. At first I was nervous, afraid I would say the wrong thing. Sarah corrected me gently, reminding me that clarity was the goal, not perfection. One elderly man came in with a stack of bills and a face full of shame. He said he didn't want to cause trouble. I recognized that sentence like a childhood lullaby. I sat with him and said, "You're not causing trouble. The trouble already exists. We're just naming it." His eyes filled with tears. In that moment, I realized I had inherited my family's empathy, but I was learning to pair it with teeth. A year after Sarah entered our lives, June received a letter from the relative side of the family, a demand for money to support an emergency. They claimed it was for a medical cost. They attached no hospital receipt, only a dramatic story and a deadline. My father's first impulse was to pay. My mother's first impulse was to feel guilty for hesitating. June stared at the letter, torn between loyalty and the new truth he had learned. Sarah didn't say no immediately. She said, "Let's verify." She called the hospital named in the letter and asked whether a patient with that name had been admitted. The hospital, bound by privacy, refused details but confirmed that no one by that name matched the stated dates. Sarah then asked for the relative's consent to share proof. The relative exploded over the phone, accusing Sarah of disrespect, accusing June of forgetting his roots. Sarah waited until the shouting burned out, then said, "If you need help, bring evidence, and we will discuss it. If you want easy money, find someone else." The relative hung up. June exhaled and said, "I think I just grew up." Sarah squeezed his hand and said, "Welcome." Sarah's clinic work took a toll. She came home some days with her shoulders tight, carrying other people's panic like a backpack she couldn't set down. June and I began taking over more household tasks without being asked. We cooked. We cleaned. We learned not to treat Sarah's strength as an excuse to lean on her. That was another lesson. Having a strong person in the family is not permission to be weak. It's an invitation to become stronger too. One night, after a particularly brutal case involving a woman whose employer had withheld wages for months, Sarah sat at our table and admitted she felt like she was scooping water out of a sinking boat. My father said quietly, "Then we will build a better boat." He didn't know exactly what he meant, but the sentence mattered because it came from him, the man who used to say, "We didn't want trouble." The trouble had not disappeared. Our relationship to it had changed. In the spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news didn't soften her boundaries, but it did rearrange her priorities. She began delegating more at the clinic, training younger advocates instead of doing everything herself. June transformed into a careful man, reading nutrition labels, installing a handrail in the stairwell, insisting she sit during long conversations. My mother treated the pregnancy like a communal project, cooking soups, learning what foods were safe, asking Sarah what she wanted instead of assuming. Sarah, who had spent her whole life bracing for disappointment, looked confused by the steady support. One evening she said, almost suspiciously, "Are you all being nice because I'm pregnant?" My mother replied, "We're being steady because we should have been steady before." Sarah stared, then laughed, then wiped her eyes as if they had betrayed her. The labor was long and messy, and nothing like the tidy stories people tell. In the hospital hallway, my father paced like a metronome, whispering prayers he hadn't practiced in years. June held Sarah's hand until his knuckles went white. I sat with my mother and realized she was not apologizing for being afraid. She was just afraid, and that honesty made her braver than any performance. When the baby finally arrived, a girl with a furious cry, Sarah looked exhausted and victorious. She said, flatly, "She will not be raised to say sorry for existing." June laughed and said, "Agreed." My father looked at the baby's tiny fist and said, "We will teach her to fix things, but also to demand fair payment." My mother kissed the baby's forehead and whispered, "You can be kind, and you can be safe." Those promises felt like vows our family had never known how to make. The months after the birth were hard in quiet ways. Sleepless nights, money worries, the constant math of time. Yet they were also full of small proofs that we had changed. When a relative tried to visit and criticize Sarah's parenting, June blocked the doorway and said, "Not today." When Mr. Park tried to raise rent again with a new excuse, the tenants group responded as a unit within 24 hours, citing the previous agreement. When a customer yelled at my mother for refusing an unfair return, my mother said, "This conversation is over," and turned away without trembling. I watched these moments like beads on a string. Each one was small. Together they formed a new backbone for our family. I finished my program and was offered an internship at a logistics firm. The salary was decent, the culture was not. During my first week, a manager joked that workers at the warehouse were replaceable, as if human beings were screws in a toolbox. The old Lena would have smiled and stayed quiet to avoid attention. The new Lena, trained by Sarah's questions, asked, "Replaceable by whom, and at what cost?" The manager laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Later, a coworker pulled me aside and whispered thanks. She said she had wanted to say something but feared retaliation. I realized then that speaking up does not always produce applause. Sometimes it produces permission for someone else. That year, the clinic asked me to help design workshops for small businesses and workers on fair contracts and payment timelines. I built sessions that translated legal language into everyday examples. How to spot hidden fees, how to request written terms, how to document conversations. We held the workshops in community rooms above temples, in the back of libraries. Even in our shop after hours, people arrived embarrassed and left taller. Watching them, I understood why Sarah had been so relentless with my family. She wasn't only protecting us, she was rehearsing a world where ordinary people didn't have to beg for respect. One afternoon, near the end of summer, I found Sarah in the shop holding a bicycle bell as if it were a strange object. The baby was asleep in a sling on June's chest, and June was adjusting a chain. Sarah tapped the bell lightly, and it chimed. She said, "You know what's funny? This sound used to mean pressure for your family. Customers, demands, apologies. Now it means work, yes, but it also means choice. Your father can choose to say no. Your mother can choose not to discount. You can choose not to marry a man who calls you easy. It's the same bell, but it rings differently." June looked up and said, "It rings like ours." Sarah nodded, and for a moment her armor looked less heavy. At the next Lantern Festival, Willow Street was crowded with neighbors eating skewers and watching children run between paper lights. Our tenants group had become a real community, not just a coalition of fear. The laundry couple danced slowly to music from a tinny speaker. The fried chicken mother handed out extra pieces without apologizing for generosity. My father told a story loudly, and no one shushed him. My mother negotiated with a supplier and didn't soften her voice. June carried his daughter on his shoulders, and she squealed as if the world were a safe place to take up space. Sarah stood beside me, watching the scene like a person trying to memorize proof. I thanked her, the way people always do to the person who changes the weather inside a house. She shook her head and said, "Don't thank me for being loud. Thank yourself for learning to speak." Then she added, quieter, I didn't save you. I just refused to participate in your fear until you got tired of it too. The river behind us reflected the lanterns. And for once, the water looked like it was carrying light instead of threat. I used to think the opposite of kindness was cruelty, and that being cruel was the only way to avoid being eaten. Sarah taught me a different opposite. The opposite of kindness is consentless surrender. You can be gentle and still be exact. You can be warm and still be firm. You can hand someone a repaired bike with a smile and also insist they pay what they owe. You can love your family and still refuse their manipulations. Our story did not end with everyone clapping or relatives transforming into saints. Some people stayed bitter. Some rumors continued, but the center held. In our apartment above the shop, apologies became rare and meaningful, reserved for real mistakes rather than for existing. The bell on the door still chimed, but now it sounded less like a leash and more like a signal. Someone has arrived, and we get to decide what happens next. The relatives did not disappear, they adapted. Aunt May began telling people she had always supported June's marriage. As if history were clay she could reshape with enough confidence. She tried to show up at our shop during busy hours, acting affectionate in front of customers, then slipping little demands into the warmth. Could June repair her friend's scooter for free? Could my mother sew a bag as a favor? Could my father lend money just until next month? The first few times my parents tensed, unsure whether refusing would start a family war. Sarah suggested a strategy that felt almost humorous: receipts for relationships. She told my mother to answer every request with one question, asked kindly but firmly, "What is your budget for this?" Aunt May blinked each time, as if the world had been rearranged. When she said, "I'm family," my mother replied, "and family should want me to eat." It was the first boundary my mother set with a smile, and the smile didn't look like fear. June's confrontation with the elders happened at a banquet we attended on purpose. In the past, we would have avoided it, letting shame grow in the dark. This time we went with a clear goal: to end the story they told about us. The hall was crowded with relatives who spoke in soft voices that carried sharpness. They praised June for finally becoming responsible, and praised Sarah for learning to be obedient, as if obedience were the only language a wife should know. Sarah listened without reacting, letting them exhaust themselves. Then June stood. His voice did not boom, but it held. He said, "I married Sarah because she respects me, and because she taught me to respect myself. If you want to be part of my family, you will speak to her with dignity. If you can't, you will not see my daughter." The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it realizes a joke has become a line. Aunt May gasped, offended. June didn't apologize. He simply sat down, and the banquet continued with new caution. That night, after we returned home, June admitted his hands had been shaking under the table. He said he felt guilty, because guilt was his old leash. Sarah kissed his forehead and said, "Guilt is not proof you did something wrong. It's proof you did something new." My father, listening from the doorway, repeated the sentence softly, as if he were memorizing it. My mother asked, almost shyly, if she could memorize it too. Sarah laughed, genuinely, and said, "Please do. It's free." We all laughed. And laughter in our house used to be the sound of making a problem smaller, but now it was the sound of making ourselves bigger. At the clinic, Sarah began training a younger advocate named Talia, a woman with quick hands and a softer voice. Sarah had resisted delegation for years, because she believed that if she wasn't holding the line would collapse. I watched her learn a different kind of strength, teaching someone else to hold it too. She let Talia lead meetings while Sarah observed, correcting only when necessary. She praised in public and critiqued in private, creating the kind of environment she had wished for when she was younger. One evening, Sarah confessed to me that being needed felt dangerous because it made her afraid to rest. I told her what she had told me on the roof. Rest is not betrayal. She stared, then smiled in a small, surprised way, like she'd found her own words on someone else's tongue. My internship turned into a job offer, and with it came a choice. The firm wanted me to relocate to a corporate district, far from Willow Street, far from the people who had shaped my spine. They offered me status in exchange for quiet. The clinic offered me less money, but a clearer purpose. I sat with my father in the shop after closing, listening to the ticking of a repaired bike wheel. I told him I was scared of choosing wrong. My father wiped grease from his hands and said, "We used to choose what kept us safe in the smallest way. Now choose what keeps you alive in the biggest way." He didn't add sorry. He didn't soften the sentence. I realized he was giving me permission to want something large. I accepted the clinic role, and we began building a program for small neighborhood businesses. Fair pricing policies, collective bargaining for supplies, shared emergency funds for disasters like the flood. We called it the Willow Network because it suggested flexibility without snapping. The first meeting was awkward. People were used to competing for scraps, suspicious that cooperation was a trick. I brought charts and simple examples. Sarah brought stories and blunt warnings. June brought coffee and quietly fixed a broken door hinge in the meeting room without being asked, which somehow made everyone trust him. My mother spoke about bookkeeping mistakes she had made, and instead of mocking her, other shop owners nodded with relief. Honesty created a bridge where politeness never had. The second flood season threatened again, but this time we prepared before the water rose. The network stored sandbags and portable pumps in a shared basement. We set up a rotating phone tree so no one would be alone when the storm came. We wrote down emergency contacts and put them on the shop walls. When the rain arrived, it still frightened us, but fear did not isolate us. The river climbed, but our response rose faster. We protected inventory, moved elders to higher floors, and ensured the delivery riders had safe shelter. Afterward, an official arrived and called our coordination impressive. Sarah asked him to put that compliment into funding. He laughed nervously. She didn't. Evan sent one last message around that time. He wrote that he was glad I had found a cause because it made me less needy. The sentence tried to turn my growth into an insult. I read it once, took a screenshot, and placed it in my evidence folder. Then I deleted the message thread and went to feed my niece. The baby gripped my finger with surprising strength, and I thought about what she would inherit. Not the shop, not the apartment, not even the network, but the practice of refusing to fold. That inheritance was invisible and heavier than property. When my niece learned to walk, she did it like she expected the floor to support her. She wobbled toward the shop bell and slapped it with both hands, delighted by the chime. My father laughed and said, "That bell means business." Sarah corrected him gently. "That bell means community." June added, "That bell means we're open, but we're not open to being treated badly." My mother kissed the baby's hair and said, "And it means you can ask for what you need." The baby babbled, uninterested in our philosophy. But the adults around her sounded like people who had rewritten their own rules. On a bright autumn evening, we closed the shop early and ate dinner in the alley behind the building, stringing cheap lights between two poles. Neighbors drifted over with bowls and stories. Someone played music through a phone speaker. People who had once avoided eye contact now argued cheerfully about recipes and repair tricks. Sarah sat beside June with the baby asleep against her chest, her face soft in a way that didn't look like surrender.